Uh, so I'm really excited tonight to be able to introduce Dr. Eddie Moore Jr. I'm just so thrilled that he agreed to be part of this. He's someone I just have a lot of love for, a lot of respect for. Uh, so I'm going to introduce Dr. Moore, and he's going to take a little time to maybe 15, 20 minutes to just talk through some stuff, present some stuff. Then he and I will have a little back and forth. I'll have some questions for him, and then we'll open it up for questions from you all. And again, I'm going to be looking for those questions in the Q&A area. As always, tomorrow I will post a link to the video so if anybody wants to rewatch it, you could do that. And we will leave you at the end of this evening with a reflection prompt. Sorry that Cheryl and I forgot to do that last week, but I did email that out to y'all. So, okay, so let's see here. So Dr. Eddie Moore Jr. has pursued and achieved success in academia, business, diversity, leadership, and community service. In 1996, he started America and More, LLC, to provide comprehensive diversity, privilege, and leadership trainings and workshops. And if you haven't been to one of his trainings or workshops, I've been able to sit in on a couple times. He and I have both been speakers or keynotes at the same conference, and I've gotten to sit in on some of his stuff. Very dynamic, very powerful. So be sure to check him out. Dr. Moore is recognized as one of the nation's top speakers and educators. His interview with Wisconsin Public Radio won the 2015 Wisconsin Broadcasters Association's Best Interview in Media Market Radio first place, and he is featured in the film I'm Not Racist, Am I? Dr. Moore is the founder and program director of the White Privilege Conference, which is basically the only conference at this point that I try to get to every year. It feels like kind of my family there. Under the direction of Dr. Moore and his inclusive relationship model, the White Privilege Conference has become one of the top national and international conferences for participants who want to move beyond dialogue and into action around issues of diversity, power, privilege, and leadership. In 2014, Dr. Moore founded the Privilege Institute, which engages people in research, education, action, and leadership through workshops, conferences, publications, and strategic partnerships and relationships. Dr. Moore is co-founder of the online journal, Understanding and Dismantling Privilege, co-editor of Everyday White People Confront Racial and Social Injustice. I wrote the foreword to that book, which was a lot of fun. The Guide to White Women Who Teach Black Boys, excellent, excellent resource. The Diversity Consulting Cookbook, Preparing for the Challenge, which is also an amazing resource, and Teaching Brilliant and Beautiful Black Girls, which I think is that out already, or is that?
No, we made the deadline today. The first official draft hit the publisher, so anticipated publication is January 2021.
Okay, excellent. For 10 years, Dr. Moore served as Director of Diversity at Brooklyn Friends School in Brooklyn, New York, and the Bush School in Seattle, Washington. Dr. Moore received his PhD from the University of Iowa in Education Leadership. His PhD research is on Black football players at Division III schools in the Midwest. You can reach Eddie on Twitter and Instagram. I'll post all of that stuff a little bit later, but we want to jump in here and not take any more time. And so I am going to hand it over to Dr. Moore, and he's going to jump into it. I am going to mute my camera here while this happens. Dr.
All right, Brother Paul, just sending you big hugs, my brother. Lots of love. I appreciate you supporting me, but especially the White Privilege Conference when those topics, and me, myself, being the one who was leading this effort, wasn't very popular in many of the circuits. So I just tremendously owe a lot of just love and respect to you for your work, but also, again, for showing me support over these years. What I wanted to do today, because I'll be back in August, and what I thought I'd do in August was focus on the Black boy book and the Black girl book, and really field some questions around that and share some of the work and research. But today I thought I'd focus primarily on my work around the white privilege conference, white supremacy, and some of how that got started, what that work is, and field some questions around that. And so what you're looking at now is just my information slide, and I'll share some of these slides with y'all as part of the resources that I give to Paul. But this is how you find me, some of the publications that he mentioned, as well as some of the other information. So that's pretty self-explanatory. As mentioned, we are really excited about the Black Girls book, and I thought it was just worth sharing because most of the research around schools and some of the real challenges has been focusing on Black boys, and rightfully so. But what we've discovered, uncovered, and really want to bring to light and provide some support around with this next project is some of the mass destruction that's happening to Black girls as well. And this is just one slide that gives you a sense. Again, I'll share this in the link that I share with Paul. I wanted to, again, get to this white privilege conference piece and share with you how that came to fruition over my development. The conference is going into its 22nd year now, and the study around white supremacy, white privilege is not something I came into the world hoping to do. This conference, the work I do is divine inspiration. And so I really just feel grateful and fortunate that I'm doing something I love to do. And it feels like now, to be honest with y'all, it really feels like finally people are listening to what we've been saying about white supremacy, white privilege. I feel like a little kid with an imaginary friend that I've been telling people about for 20 years, that we've been trying to organize and present and study around for 20 years. And finally now, it's like you could say white supremacy in circles and people are not scattering and running away. But this all started for me in my master's degree program as I begin to digest the work of Kimberly Crenshaw and really understanding intersectionality, as well as some of the more recent work and research around conscious bias. I think in my early days of diversity, I just want to do, Black man, Iowa, how do you survive? That's kind of how I got started. But getting into my master's degree, getting some subject matter around intersectionality really just kind of opened my mind and connected me to some of the more relevant and important work and research. And that began to evolve into really understanding not just diversity, but white supremacy, white privilege, white cultural dominance. Not looking at the most oppressed. I think it's important to look at the folks who are down and out, but really looking at what's it like on the other side. And I think we're seeing this right now, and rightfully so. We're talking about COVID-19 and some of the devastation that's happening to people of color, particularly Black folks. But simultaneously, we need to be talking about what it's like to be white, to be watching that. What are the messages being sent? White supremacy, to me, is stronger, possibly due to COVID-19. Like there's a real clear message that it's good to be white. And what I continue to see people focusing on and saying is all the devastation that's happening, which is important. But we can't forget about, as we're talking to the people who are being pushed down, we're sending messages to those who are being raised up. And it's having an impact on the psyche. And that's really what I've been interested in looking at, is the impact of white supremacy on white people, but also people of color within that structure. So what you're looking at here is just a bunch of numbers, facts. If anybody's arguing whether or not it's good to be white in America, these are some things you could show to them, share with them, the stats and facts around that. All right. For me, in addition to some of the knowledge around the numbers, I was looking at some Afrocentric psychology and information, as well as Joe Fagan, who wrote the text that also contributed to my expansion into white supremacy, and that is The White Racial Frame. I highly recommend these 3 books in whatever way you want to digest them. But for me, these were just so instrumental in taking my knowledge, expanding my knowledge. And as I got into my PhD, the coursework, I began to think, we gotta study more about white supremacy, white privilege. And that's really the birthplace of the White Privilege Conference, right? To begin to study the impact of white supremacy, how it's formulated, how it's instituted in society. And when I took my first professional job after my coursework of my PhD, where I'd consumed all those kinds of texts that I mentioned, all those kinds of stats and facts, it was then I launched the idea of a place of study, a conference that looks at white supremacy, white privilege, and other forms of oppression. To go beyond diversity, kumbaya. I think diversity is an important topic. It's important to know, and people got to get on board. But we got to be looking at structural, systemic, white cultural, white male supremacy, white cultural design, and all its impact. And so the way it gets infiltrated in the messages of TV, the way it gets infiltrated in the messages of magazines and products that we consume, that we give out, the way that it is embedded in our TV shows and our movies that we watch, even in our kids' books. Now, some would argue some of those things have changed over the years. And yes, I would be in agreement with that. When you look at TV today, the content is much more diverse than it was when Father Knows Best hit the TV. But the question is power structure. White supremacy in the structural design, where you could sprinkle some diversity, but is the mindset of power consistent in the way it operates today, opposed to the way that it got started? That's what I wanted to look at. And so I would argue, even though you have one change in the structure, if you don't look at that structural design, it'll bounce back. It'll come back to place. And so that's what we're trying to look at the White Privilege Conference, is all these elements of white supremacy, how it can have white liberal teachers, positive, productive, caring citizens who love their country, whether it's domestic here in the US or global, as I've seen there with some of our Northern Canadian neighbors. It'll have sweet old you, even though you look one way or believe one way, if you don't understand the way systems operate, white supremacy, white male cultural dominance, you'll be producing the results of that systemic design. And if there's any area where we've seen white supremacy permeate and get the results it was designed to get, is education. In fact, I often argue there's nothing wrong with education. The system isn't broken. It's actually working exactly in the way that it was designed. And it's important to remember, it's not the Ku Klux Klan that's often operating these institutions. It may be good old, positive, productive, white liberal folks of color as well, who are different in their visual presentation or maybe even their belief system, but their behaviors is white supremacy. Look at the stats and facts. That's what I argue. So that's what we're trying to do at White Supremacy, at the White Privilege Conference, study white supremacy, its impact, the way it changes policy, the way it impacts policy, where it changes people's decisions, where it impacts people's decisions, I mean, Flint, Michigan, the water decision is a perfect example of that. I'm guessing there were some good people sitting around that table that made this decision, a decision of white supremacy. I mean, I'm hoping, I'm guessing that these folks, in the way that they grew up, wasn't the way that they ended up. But this is how we get to the chapter that I shared with y'all around the N-word. Is I argue that this is a manufactured, a product of white supremacy, white male culture dominance. That it'll have good people who start out in a way like all young people start, ending up doing some of the most harmful things. This is what we're trying to look at the White Privilege Conference in the study of white supremacy. Let me get towards the end by sharing one other important thing and then some resources about change, and then we'll get to some questions, okay? Now, two of the most preeminent books I think that every person of color need to be reading is My Grandmother's Hands by my homie Resma, and also Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome by Dr. Joy. I mean, these texts I think are really important to talk about and understand the injurious impact of white supremacy on people of color. Now, we can participate in some unhealthy results of that, but also we got to be paying attention to the demise, to the destruction. So I wanted to mention those texts as well. Action, last few things I want to touch on in reference to action. We created or tried to create some kind of rubric, Debbie Irving and I, primarily to help people to look at white supremacy and their behavior. Now, I don't know if this works. The bottom line is, have you done an audit of white supremacy of your organization? Maybe try your home. Look around. You're at home now. How does your home radiate white supremacy, or does it? Have you done an assessment around that? And this tool was designed to do that. And if you click on this link, it gives you some of the research that shows what a white supremacy, white culture dominance environment looks like, and you can measure your environment. And some of it you may be able to control, like your home. Some of it maybe not, like your school, but at least you can have an impact in your classroom. This is an action tool to try to get people working. The 21-day action plan is another thing that we tried to create. I really brought this to fruition 7 years ago and reached out to Debbie Irving shortly after coming up with the idea, and with her and Marguerite, we kind of expanded and strengthened it. But it's really a tool to just get people talking about white supremacy, white male cultural dominance, or diversity in general. Here are some other texts. I'm just showing this to you quickly, but I'll send this to Paul. Y'all can have it. Just to give you a sense that even now, today, there's many more texts around white supremacy, white cultural dominance, teaching tools, learning tools. I mean, there are even books out there with how we fight white supremacy in the title. So think about this. In the last 5 years, I mean, just the ability to learn more, know more around white supremacy specifically. We're not talking about diversity. I'm talking about white supremacy, white male cultural dominance. The information around understanding that is out there more and more. And I think this is an area white teachers, white liberal teachers especially, and particularly during this time, this is what I want to know. Is this the work that people are willing to do? Or are you motivated? Is your energy, is your excitement now around basic diversity? I mean, I don't know. I'm feeling like, I don't know if people are, because of the time we're in now, excited to participate in the challenging of white supremacy, white male cultural dominance, the structural, the foundational premise of this nation, of, I think, nations like Canada and others, the UK. I don't know. It feels like to me what the excitement is around is to just participate in diversity conversations. Now, if I'm wrong, what I'm asking people about is, are you willing to engage this kind of text, this kind of knowledge? This is where we got to go. This is where I want us to be excited, what I want us to be excited about. That's the kind of work we're trying to do. And I'm going to close out because most people want to know, am I optimistic about the future or am I pessimistic? I don't know how y'all are feeling. I'll be interested to hear some of your questions around that and other things. I'm even interested in Brother Paul and where he stands on this. But I'll tell you, I'm not optimistic. You watch a black man die on TV for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. The thing I'm most frustrated about in reference to George Floyd is the fact that I'll never get that image out of my mind. I've been traumatized for life. And I don't know, did I need to see that? Maybe, to keep my fire even burning longer and stronger. I don't know. But I'll tell you what I feel like is missing from the examination of the lynching, the murder of George Floyd, is the participation of whiteness, like the ability of that white man to sap life out of that brother and show no emotion, no care, no love. Now, I don't know how y'all feel about this, but when it comes to education, this reminds me of a white liberal teacher showing up every day, destroying the lives of Black genius, Black excellence, students of color, and not only in many cases keeping their job, sometimes even getting promoted. And so I'm not optimistic. Now, I'm not a pessimistic guy either. I can't operate in the negative every day, all day. I mean, I'm a Black man with a PhD. I mean, I came from crack cocaine addiction, and now I have a PhD. So it's just hard to get a Black man down when you've overcome those kinds of hurdles. So I'm not pessimistic. That's where I created my new word, and that's what I want to leave y'all with, is a spirit of pessimism. To be more pessimistic. Pessimistic means you're optimistic, but you're doing stuff. So I'm happy that y'all are joining us here tonight as part of your action. With that, Brother Paul, hopefully I was able to stay in my time frame. I'm going to pass it back to you to see what questions you have and maybe what questions others may have. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
All right, thank you. And I want to remind people to, if you have questions, post them in the Q&A. That's where I'm looking for questions. The chat box just moves too fast. Just listening to you, Eddie, the thing that I really want to ask you about is about emotional labor, because I think one of the things a lot of white people, white people, don't understand is just the amount, it's one thing to be, to fight against racism. It's another thing to be the target of racism, to be part of a community that is the target of racism, and also to find the emotional, all of the different kinds of energy to always be the one saying the hard thing, always be the one asking the hard question, and the sort of emotional labor that goes into it. And I think part of the privilege of whiteness is to be involved in a way that doesn't require, no white person is going to be involved in a way that requires the same amount of emotional labor because we're protected from the racial oppression. But I do think there often in schools is an expectation that that people of color will do all of the expenditure of the emotional labor to ask the hard question, raise the difficult question. And I just wonder what you think about that or what you've seen related to that.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I think for me, I've made a decision, and fortunate and blessed through just many different ways in which this has happened to me. But I think in the last 5 years, especially realized like this is the work I've been called to do. So I know doing this work, there is essentially a tax, a price you have to pay. I mean, from death threats for myself that I've received, so to speak, from the fear, the sheer fear of, just standing there as a Black man, so to speak. The kind of suspicion, the kind of hesitancy that you have to endure. And I don't think I'm alone in that. And I don't think it's just, Black men. I think also Black women in a very different way, but also multiracial. I mean, just what you're saying about this tax, about this price, I think, especially as a person of color doing this work, I've come now to expect that that's part of my work. But what really gets under my skin, what really hurts, the real kind of drain or added pain and drain associated with that is when, according to your title, right, the good people, like the liberal, like the folks who are supposed to be on board or are afraid of me. Like the people who are supposed to be on board are doubting whether or not my credentials are enough or are real, or the text that I've written has the right or white research associated with it. I mean, that's really, for me, where the tax takes its toll, is when it feels like the most resistant is coming from the person or people who's supposed to be the most on board.
We have a few questions that sort of relate to that, which is what, well, maybe I can sort of get at the question kind of in a backdoor way, which is, what are some of the ways that you see white educators who kind of imagine ourselves, I'm one of those white people, as committed to racial justice, engaging in a way that does harm instead of contributing to the movement? I mean, you mentioned that piece about doubting your credentials and questioning your credentials or being afraid of you. Are there other examples of that you've come up against?
Yeah, I think a couple that come to mind is when the answers that are valued are associated with the credentials of the person. So you could have a community member or a parent with just as much knowledge and experience around the subject matter, the challenge, yet if they don't hold sometimes those titles or have been to college, so to speak, I mean, they can officially be silent or cast out because they don't fit the hierarchy. They haven't been to the right school, so on and so forth. I think that's one way I see a kind of good person doing devastating things. And the other thing, as I mentioned, right, I think for me, again, is specifically leadership, Black leadership, like the inability. I truly believe, in my experience, that there's still so many folks there who haven't had the experience of Black leadership and sometimes actually lack the ability to follow Black leaders, to believe Black people, to trust Black people. And especially as a nonprofit, the research is bearing this actually, in looking at nonprofits and the funding of nonprofits, that there's a real disparity in the amount of resources being distributed, or even in the consideration of these organizations getting grants. And some of it may be part of kind of this organizational structural hurdle that they have to overcome. But there's also been some conversations about the sheer fact that there's a Black person at the head of the organization has created suspicion and hesitancy in reference to whether they get the grant or get the funding. And I think that that's another area where I feel like there's some real white people devastation, destruction, anti-Blackness going
Yeah, and I know we've talked about how some of that stuff even going on around the white privilege conference. Well, one thing I'll say that one thing I think is pretty, in a way, is unique about the white privilege conference is that you have a lot of education people, including some like academics who are coming from that position. You have people who are working in K-12 schools, but you also have community activists who will sit in a session, and if people start in on sort of like that, uber academic language, and who will call that out and be like, what the fuck are y'all talking about here? I'm actually out doing this work. And yeah, that's one of the most powerful things about the conference for sure. Um, so somebody asked, you made that comment about destroying Black genius, and somebody asked, what can individual educators, uh, I'm paraphrasing here, but what can individual educators do, when they see at an institutional level in their schools that happening? Like, what is the role of a teacher? What is the best way to interrupt that, I guess?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think depending on if you're seeing it from afar or if it's your behavior directly, I mean, the answer to that may vary, but I mean, I think that there has to be at least some acknowledgement, some willingness to name the fact that we are failing Black kids. We are sending more Black kids to special blah, 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 as opposed to BA or associate's degree or graduation. So I think some real honesty and transparency around the state of affairs is really important when you're thinking about institutionally. And then I think individually, again, I feel like I'm facing teachers who've been teaching 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. And what I'm asking them is, how many Black PhDs have you produced? If you've had Black students, yet Black males especially, how many BAs, how many MAs? I mean, just to set goals around your students of color is what I argue, what I ask of as people look at the next 25 years. If you could see yourself 10 years, you're going to have 5 Black students a year, make a goal. I'm going to have a doctor in there. I'm going to have a lawyer in there. I'm going to have a scientist in there. Like, set those kinds of goals. But most importantly, I'll say this: the best friend that hate has is silence. The strongest piece of advice I can give folks is say something. It's hard to answer that not knowing all the dynamics, but my basic frustration is there's no consequence to Black destruction, to anti-Blackness, to the kind of dismal, horrific numbers we're seeing when it comes to some districts graduating students of color, particularly Black males or kids of color, specifically Black girls. There's no consequence. And so I think that's some of what we got to look at as we look at the next 25 years.
I think in a way that's a really important message for school leaders and district leaders. Like, what is the accountability? If you are investing in racial justice, how are you holding accountable the adults in your building or district who are opting out of that? Because if there's no equity, if there's no accountability, if I can opt out of it, that means it's not a real commitment.
It's just like what we're seeing with some of the police and the culture of the police. And if we're discovering, hey, this is a racist, this is a white supremacist on the force, and they're causing destruction, they're wreaking havoc in neighborhoods, this person has got to go. And I think that has got to be a mantra for me, particularly when we're dealing with K-5, middle school even. Like, we're seeing people, identifying young kids as early as 3rd grade, 2nd grade as trouble, assigning harm to them at, 7, 8, 9 years old. Like, that's got to be unacceptable. Maybe there's some kids that can show some signs at that age of some really horrific behaviors. And I'm not arguing that some of that can't be true, but, to be looking at what the research is showing in reference to how people are seeing young kids of color, particularly Black kids, especially, Black girls and Black boys, the areas that I spent some time in some specific study, and really just expecting that they'll be in special ed the rest of their schooling. Or they can't make it out. Like, these are the stories that kids are reporting, remembering. And so I think that that's some of the stuff that we got to really begin to look at in the same way that we're looking at and having some real important, critical, serious conversations about eliminating the white supremacist and white supremacist behaviors in the police department. I'd like to think that there may be some of that in the education in the school building as well.
Yeah. When I've been working with administrators, I've been saying your first line of accountability is hiring. Anti-racist schools do not hire racist teachers. So how are you making sure you're not hiring racist teachers? Of course, that gets back to like who carries the load, because then the question is, do the people who are doing the hiring know how to recognize that or not? And is it going to be like this extra service that teachers of color have to do because now they have to be on all these hiring committees, to help with that? There's a question here about, could you shed light on the ways white teachers commit violence against Black students in classrooms, or the way that school rules and policies in schools are violent against Black students? I guess you talked about that a little bit, but any other thoughts on that?
Yeah. The couple of ways I think about is when I think people think about violence, it doesn't have to necessarily be a physical altercation or something to that extent. I mean, I'm saying to really, talk down on the kid, or assume the kid is stupid, or to be so surprised that they gave the right behavior or right answer in reference to the question. Like, to me, those are some injurious wounds that you're inflicting on the young person. And I classify that as some violent behavior. That if the student answers the question right, you're like, oh my God, I can't believe you knew that, right? Or the student challenges you on the birthplace of the Statue of Liberty, right? Because they've got some Afrocentric understanding of that from the history that's now being uncovered about how that really got in place. Like, I mean, there's like a physical, visceral reaction that could have that teacher behaving negatively towards that student the rest of the year because they feel attacked or made fun of because they didn't know that answer. I think that's some of the kinds of behaviors that I think about in reference to violent behavior towards kids. That, I mean, violence not necessarily meaning the physical, but really the kind of wounds that are being inflicted on the kids that last a long time. And the reason I mention that is because we've been, hearing from young people with these book projects. And some of them have been interviews, like, kids who are, I mean, even grown adult males now, like remembering what their sixth grade teacher said, what their sixth grade teacher did. Remember what happened to them in third grade even. And so to me, when somebody can have that kind of memory around a negative experience, to me, that classifies as violent behavior.
Yeah. Kind of makes me think about the popularity of trauma-informed practices and the lack of reflection and trauma-informed stuff about the traumas that schools are causing to students. I always think the first trauma-informed commitment is, what are the ways that we are traumatizing students in this school? And if we don't start there, then that whole trauma-informed thing to me just seems hypocritical.
Paul, I just want to say quickly what's really important now, because we're going to have kids coming back to school who've watched one of the most horrific traumas to occur in our lifetime.
Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, really, if how people are going to be prepared to talk about that, and there are even more and more clips now being shown, right? So there's going to be an accumulation of trauma when you watch what happened to Ahmaud Arbery, or even I showed the clip of the white woman in the Central Park, right? To me, I'm a grown man. Like, I'm thinking when I see the clip or I see a possible post, and I think to myself, I don't know if I'm ready to watch this. I don't know if I can watch, and I'm a grown dude, right? Like, I can imagine what a 12-year-old, 8-year-old, 10-year-old, and I think we're in a new environment in reference to COVID and some of the outright most traumatic kinds of incidences happening right before our eyes.
Here's a kind of an interesting question. Do you think we can change the story for students of color in education without dismantling the whole system?
Can we change the story? I mean, I don't know if that means the outcome, where they end up, or I'm not sure I have clarity around what that means outside of systemic change. But I will say that we have seen examples of kids, teachers who've been able to find some success in some of the toughest situations. Mm. And I hope that we can continue to see some of that, but I don't know, systemic change, I don't even know if you're feeling like that's even possible. I don't know after some of what's been happening now. What I'm trying to make sure of is, as I look back 20 years from now, 25 years from now, that I'm able to say with clarity, with specifics, what it is I was doing to push back, who it is I was assisting, supporting, challenging, so on and so forth. And I'm not sure if that gets at that question, but I think that there's been examples of people being able to accomplish some great things, even in some of the most difficult situations in schools and organizations when it comes to especially kids of color.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you a question specifically about that in a second, but I think that gets back to also your point about that the system is working exactly as it's been designed to work. And I think one of the big ways that kind of liberal white people trip up in this work is sort of tinkering around the edges. So we're not going to do anything about these racist policies or institutional culture, but we'll have this restorative justice program, or we'll have this, diversity aware, or a student club, that sort of thing. So how do people move from that sort of tinkering around the edges to trying to get more at the root of what's of the problem?
Well, I think, again, part of what we tried to create with the White Privilege Conference is a space and place where people could say white supremacy, white male culture dominance. Part of making the change is being able to identify what it is you're trying to change. I often feel like people are trying to accomplish some kind of progress, some kind of different result in a system or an organization or a situation that they never even talked about. They can't even say white at the school, nevertheless say white supremacy. And until we're able to name it and now put some study towards it, because it's not just a white supremacist extreme group that's out there, we're now seeing white supremacy have organization, have power structure, have strategy, gain access, established position. Like, these are the kind of things that we're seeing white supremacists. I mean, in fact, the Ku Klux Klan white supremacists, they have evolved over the last 40, 45 years. I mean, they got new names now. They got new jobs now. What I'm wondering is, are those of us fighting for social justice, for equity, for the kind of results that we want to see in the future, are we evolving our tactics, our strategies? And I think part of that is being able to say, you know what? This school was designed by white supremacy, and we want to see it different in the next 10 years. And that be the starting point, as opposed to, how can we get this? How can we get that? How can we add the fringes?
Yeah. So I love that you brought up strategy and tactic, because I think so much of racial justice work in schools is just sort of driven by ideology and not by tactic. We need to actually think strategically about the changes that we want to create. Uh, Here's an interesting question. Someone who says that they work in a very white, very conservative school district. I'm curious if you, and people often ask me this, I'm sure you get this question all the time. Does racial justice work look different in that kind of district than it looks in a more racially diverse, maybe more less conservative district? Are there differences in the ways that you're engaging people when you go into those kinds of contexts?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's where strategy comes in. It's like, I mean, it's like any kind of equitable classroom, right? You can't treat all the students the same. You got to know what the challenge is, where the challenges are, and then institute a kind of mode of operation based on that. And I think, conservative, white, depending on the resources, depending on where religion lies in there, depending on how the role of white women, I mean, all of that I think matters in what could be possible in the strategy in which you employ, whether it's in the curriculum, whether it's hiring, so on and so forth.
I'm not quite sure how to phrase this question, so I'm just going to throw it out there, and you can reshape it or answer, But to what extent, when you're going into any kind of school district, do you think about how much is your message driven by how you think people are going to hear you as a Black man with that message?
Oh, yeah. I can't, there's not a presentation that I don't do with keeping that in mind. Part of why I many times try to be in partnership with a white person, because my experience has shown that me delivering that can be received differently, whether it's you, but especially if it's Allie Michael or Debbie Irving.
Yeah.
So I may have done that so many times that it just may be a figment of my imagination. I'm not denying that maybe I'm a little extra paranoid around that, but consistently I face situations where I feel like, for example, here's a perfect example. One of the things we talk about in the Black Boy book is white women tears. Okay, so when I bring that up, without Debbie Irving or Marguerite Penick Parks, both who are white women, alone in the presentation, it's received differently than when even the two of them are together. Even when one of them is with me and we're together and I bring it up, but especially if they lead that portion of the exercise and they bring it up.
Yeah.
And I'm talking about, some, I don't want to say violence in the way that it's, physical, but definitely some real venom that's coming at me in a way that, how dare I even assume a white woman would cry on purpose.
Mm. That's kind of what I wrote about in the white anti-racist people book, about how even in the context of racial justice work, whiteness is privileged. So I can say things and be heard differently from how you're heard saying the same thing. And as a result of that, a lot of white people actually get credit for the ideas of people of color and institutions, where the institutions haven't been willing to hear that from people of color. So I want to jump back into the classroom here. Some people want to talk about the N-word stuff. A few people are asking questions. I'm just going to try to compile them into a couple questions, but is it when and how and based on what kind of pre-work is it ever appropriate to use literature with the N-word in it? And one person is specifically talking about works by Black authors, and I'm also sort of curious about what sort of, what do you think teachers need to do if they're going to use that literature, any sort of pre-work to engage people in those conversations?
Yeah, all good stuff. What I normally say around this is, I don't know what the right answer is for each teacher, each school. It can be different, but there should be some training that goes into place before you teach this text, whoever the author is, because, and most people think that's because of the kids of color. And that's not what I'm talking about. Like, I'm worried about the way white kids are going to be receiving this, which is, I argue, one of the most unexamined parts of the population consuming the N-word is white students. And so I think that there needs to be a real competency level, a high competency level for the teacher, for the faculty member teaching these texts. Now, I say all of that, and all the work I've done around this N-word, 15 years plus I've been doing this workshop, which I based that chapter off of. All of that is pre-COVID, pre-Aubrey, pre-Floyd. We are in a new landscape. We're in a new, I think, almost new world. And maybe, I don't know, maybe it won't be received differently than it was last school year, but it's quite possible the way you bring that up, how you bring that up, when you bring that up in schooling in the future can be received differently by students of color, white students, so on and so forth. So I'm advocating for what I call a N-word certification program. Like, any teacher, any faculty member teaching this word in their text should have some kind of competency training. And again, it's not to say you'll prevent everything or you'll know everything, but at least you'll be able to speak to some of the issues from some skill set. Where what we see most of the time, Paul, is most teachers are teaching this text and have no experience with the way in which it lands on different populations. In some cases, they're operating on their middle school hip hop, Tupac days. And sometimes thinking they could say it, sometimes letting the kids say it. And so this is what I'm advocating for, is a new level of competence around this word as we continue to see this be one of the most divisive words in our society today, particularly in schools.
As a former teacher educator, I feel like I also bear some responsibility, because I don't think teacher education prepares teachers how to do that. It's not sort of built in. And especially now when everyone's obsessed with how do you maximize test scores in kids, I think there's often even less of that conversation. So one person, is quick question about the White Privilege Institute. We talked about it a little bit, but maybe you could speak more to it. Someone asked, is the White Privilege Conference intended for K-12 educators?
Yeah. So yeah, the conference, as you mentioned earlier, it's, I think, one of the unique things about the White Privilege Conference is it has people from all over education, all levels, pre-K, 16, as well as community activists, corporate, nonprofit. So we really work hard to try to bring a diverse group of people. And because of that diversity, we have a diverse curriculum, diverse programming, workshops, performances, keynotes, all of that kind of stuff. And so, yes, the White Privilege Conference is for pre-K even to 16 educators.
I would just estimate, based on my experience, that maybe up to half of the people, maybe even more than half of the people who attend the conference are education people either in P12 or higher ed. It just seems like a big, or maybe those are the people who come to my sessions because I'm an education person, but it's a lot of education people.
Yeah, well, two things on that. One, it's been 15 years trying to get people to come to the White Privilege Conference. As I said, as a Black man walking around saying, hey, you should come to the White Privilege Conference, it hasn't been always positively received. So I've just been out there trying to get people to attend, to consider it as part of their personal professional development. And most of the circles, secondly, that I've done that in are the circles I operate in, and being a school teacher myself, a coach myself, and of course a PhD learning to teach future teachers. That's been the network in which we spread the word, and I think that's what's contributed to 60-70% being educators. And I think over the last 5 years we begin to see more and more other folks filter in, because I've been able to now, outside of education, to begin to share with people the importance of coming to the conference, letting them know it wasn't just for educators. And so I think that's what's contributed to now probably, like you said, 60-40. It's been really great to see that diversity, not just from visible, but also background, jobs, so on, coming to the conference.
So one thing we were talking about before we got started was affinity groups, and that's something that is built into the White Privilege Conference. And I know that's a popular thing in schools, and now it's becoming more popular to have white affinity groups, so white people are kind of doing their own work. I know another thing that's popular are like book groups and that sort of thing. What are your thoughts on particularly white affinity groups? And do they work, and how can they, how have they been effective at the conference?
Yeah, the effectiveness of the white affinity groups, but affinity groups in general at the White Privilege Conference, is primarily due to the leadership and the people leading those affinity spaces. And those folks having some relationship with each other and some skill building, some competencies around the different kind of dynamics that show up. And so I think that's the most critical piece around the affinity space for people of color, BIPOC folks, as well as for white folks, but in particular for white folks. That many times what we see at White Privilege is a lot of people coming to the affinity space for the first time. And so you have to have some skilled people in there when you have folks experiencing that for the first time, for a number of reasons. Mainly because we don't want people coming there just to, exercise their fears and tears. Affinity is about action at the White Privilege Conference, that it's a way to really talk about some of the things and share some of the things that you grapple with through the conference, but also to talk about how we can be in support, take action once we leave the conference.
And I have to say, I've participated in several of those, and the facilitation is quite good. You do a really good job identifying who's going to do the facilitating there. How can a white educator promote and celebrate and protect Black excellence in ways that matter, in ways that aren't saviorish and that sort of thing?
Yeah, well, what I see most, and I'll share this for the next time, but there's an exercise that we do as part of the Black Board Project and talk about Black excellence, is most white people don't even know Black excellence. I mean, the only Black person they know is Martin Luther King Jr. So one of the things to help promote Black excellence is to know Black excellence, to have some familiarity with Black excellence, and especially the times in which many of the folks that, acquired some of the greatest contributions that our nation has ever seen under some of the harshest conditions. And so I think that knowing Black excellence is one way to be able to foster that. And it requires high expectations, because sometimes when you're expecting a lot out of a kid of color, there can be some pushback from them even. And they may call you a racist, think you're picking on them, right? You gotta be able to, when you pursue Black excellence, set the expectations high. This is one of the things I'm most frustrated with as well with K-12, but particularly 9-12. They think success is graduation. What I'm saying is success is your highest level possible. That's Black genius. That's Black excellence. And I think that that's what I'm asking teachers, pushing, challenge teachers to foster out of students of color, particularly Black students, and especially Black males when I'm working with folks, working with that specific group, that we do it with them athletically, and we should be doing it with them academically as well. But you go to the football team, and there's 90% brother.
Uh-oh, you froze up a little bit. Hopefully you'll pop back in here.
They should be populating talented and gifted just like they populate the basketball team.
What is a book that you would recommend, if you had to recommend one book that might create some discomfort for white educators, but has an important message? And maybe, and the person specifically asking, you know, there are all the books that are sort of in the press right now. I guess that would be like White Fragility and all that. But is there a book that isn't maybe getting that much press that that you would recommend people read?
I think, actually, I would recommend, number one, if you're saying Black matters, Black life matters, Black lives matter, if you're supporting Black Lives Matter, then you should read the autobiography from the founder of Black Lives Matter. Most people can't even tell the story. So that's number one. I think this is a book that I don't think is getting the kind of press it deserves, particularly related to the organization that has been really instrumental in getting us to this time. That's number one. I would recommend that. Now, I think more than ever, this book is getting a little bit more press, but I don't think it's quite the press I would like. But this is one that I love. Most recent that's been helping me is White Rage. And I think that we have got to be preparing for the work and research of Carol Anderson around white rage, which is actually the response of white people whenever there's success of people of color within a white supremacy structure. Black Wall Street, Rosewood, examples like that. And I think some folks are experiencing that right now. I mean, think about this, you know, we've seen the Mississippi flag taken down. We've seen NASCAR take away the Confederacy. We've seen some states, statues and monuments coming down. I mean, I never thought I'd see it, Paul, but I don't believe it until I see it. I'm not believing it yet, but Washington says they're going to change the logo. And so what I'm saying is all those kinds of successes are going to spark what Carol Anderson talks about, white rage. And that book has been really helpful to kind of just be real prepared to understand some of the phenomenons that happen when you have success around these kinds of issues.
So I want to ask you one more question, and then we'll need to wrap up. But I thought this was really compelling, and I know some of you have additional questions, and we'll figure out a way maybe to have Dr. Moore answer those offline. But this person says, I'm worried about white educators showing up to their classrooms, whether virtual or physical, all fired up to talk to students about racism and white supremacy, but without the necessary culture building, you know, within the environment to do that effectively. I'm particularly worried about the impact on students of color. So do you have suggestions for how this person can support their white colleagues who are energized, you know, without telling them to slow down, but, you know, how do you build a classroom culture where, you know, where you're not just sort of diving into that conversation? What is the pre-work maybe that needs to happen there.
Yeah, and I think that key term is build. I mean, it's an ongoing process. I think it's got to be in the teacher preparation in the days leading up to school. I think there has to be a faculty, a teacher community effort to say, we're going to address this. We're going to be better prepared to address these issues. Here are some things that we can all agree on. Here are some places and spaces in case it goes wrong, right? Like to be preeminent, to be preventative in your strategy as opposed to being reactive. And I think in addition to some of the issues, I mean, we have this election on the horizon. I think this is another cycle in our history that we got to be better prepared for. And I think that it is imperative as we begin to get ready to get back to school that part of our professional, personal development is preparing for the kind of issues that are going to come up, the kind of triggering, the kind of trauma, where spaces and places will be in case there's a reaction, who are going to be some of the key people that have the skills. So I think just being really strategic, collaborative in reference to your preparation, because I think it's safe to say that these are going to be some issues that rise up in reference to schools and school buildings over the next few weeks and also months as we lead up to the election.
Oh, there's so much work to do. And, you know, we have to wrap up. Thankfully, Dr. Moore will be back with us when we do the follow-up series in August. So if anybody wants to reconnect, that's one way to reconnect. And I'll send out I'll send out links to all the resources that were shared and that sort of thing. And one thing we want to leave people with is a reflection prompt, and we're calling them reflection to action prompts. It's something they can be working on in terms of their own sort of reflection to action over the next week before the next session, which is with Cornelius Minor. So I wonder if you have a challenge to lay out to participants around something that they can work on in terms of their own reflection to action.
Yeah, actually, you know, the challenge that I lay out to folks, is really embedded in the work that we've done around the 21-day action plan, which you can see here. And the great thing about the plan now, Paul, is it has expanded. So we have racial equity. We also have some knowledge around protests and rebellions. We have self-care, and we just did a new one about youth, faith, and race. So in those plans, there are so many options that you could do, so many things that you can do, little things, longer things. And that's what I would challenge people to do over the next week. One thing a day, one little thing, a 3-minute YouTube video, listen to a 2-minute song. There's so many options in these plans. In fact, I'll be posting tonight a Native American. We just completed one on Native Americans and knowledge around that. So that's my challenge to the group, is to pick one thing a day for the next 7 days, and be able to hopefully talk with someone, learn with someone, and maybe share some of that or reflect on some of that with Brother Cornelius and Brother Paul next week. And I'll see y'all in about a month's time or so when I come back to talk about the Black Boy and Black Girl book projects that we put together.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Eddie. You know, the amount of respect and love I have for you is tremendous. And it's hard to be, talking with you without, giving you the customary hug and handshake. So hopefully, maybe around 2023, 2024, we'll be back to that. But thank you so much for taking the time. And thank you all participants for fantastic questions. Just like last week, I'll be sending out resources, and I'll send out the link so you can find the 21-day challenge as well. Thank you all very much. And Dr. Moore, talk to you soon, buddy.
My brother, Wakanda, here's a Wakanda hug for you. Peace.